Stadia continues to be a pointless product. People are still wondering just who is it for? Why is the business model the way it is? Who's going to buy this? And this has all in large part to do with the fact that Stadia offers a worse gaming experience but still charges the same amount for games, which you have to purchase separately. Games on Stadia right now flat out have worse visuals. They perform worse. They have steep internet requirements. There's a monthly fee associated with basic features like 4K 60 FPS. And then it turns out a lot of the games don't even run at 4K 60 FPS. There's the lack of game ownership for the individual purchases that you're making at full price, a bunch of missing features, there are a bunch of missing games, a bunch of broken promises. The list just goes on. Now, I've heard some say that, well, you don't have to buy expensive hardware like consoles and gaming PCs to play games, but at $10 a month, that money eventually adds up, and you could end up paying about the same or more compared to actually buying a console or a PC. And what you get is an inferior gaming experience, one with too many drawbacks and one that is too unreliable. Now in this video, I want to once again focus on the promise of 4K 60 frames per second. Keep in mind that this was a huge marketing push throughout Stadia's marketing campaign. This was emphasized during press conferences. And if you look at the launch trailer for Stadia, 4K 60 FPS is sort of shoved in your face. But we know that a lot of these big AAA titles don't in fact run at 4K 60 frames per second and actually perform worse than the less powerful consoles. Google servers are supposed to be like twice as powerful as Xbox One X and yet run games at lower resolution and lower frame rate. We have talked about Red Dead Redemption 2. We have talked about Destiny 2. Now let's talk about two more games that news outlet Eurogamer has analyzed. So first things first, let's talk about Final Fantasy 15, which recently came out on Stadia, and the headline here sets the mood and the tone for this particular article. The headline reads, Final Fantasy 15 on Stadia, an unambitious port of a great game. This excerpt reads, there is a severe lack of ambition in this Stadia port in terms of its core technological credentials. Google's on-paper CPU and GPU spec outstrips Xbox One X in all dimensions, yet Final Fantasy 15 on Stadia runs at just 1080p at 30 frames per second, delivering an overall experience closer to the base PlayStation 4. And keep in mind, this isn't just on Google Chrome, which is capped at 1080p. This is also on the Chromecast Ultra device, which is currently the only device that can run games at 4K 60 FPS. Even in the best conditions, Final Fantasy 15 Stadia port maxes out at 1080 30 FPS. And then Eurogamer added right here, for our work, we access the 4K feed on a 300 megabits per second connection rated excellent by the service. We have had some issues here actually. Sometimes the same connection is merely rated good and we don't get 4K at all. So this once again highlights the unreliable nature of Google Stadia. Even if you have excellent internet connection, for reasons unknown, you might see stutters and resolution and frame rate dips. There's just no way to tell how Stadia is going to perform in your home, in your office, with your internet connection. And so long as Stadia remains unreliable, it's just not a product that can be recommended, given that there is a chance you might be spending money on the $130 Founders Edition and on these games sold separately at full price for an experience that's just untenable for your home, for your internet service and your internet data caps. Eurogamer then proceeded by highlighting how even if the video stream itself is 4K from Chromecast Ultra, pixel counts of the image still comes in at a native 1920 by 1080 for Final Fantasy 15. And then Eurogamer further elaborated with, there is no competition when stacked up against Xbox One X's 4K mode, which actually runs at a dynamic resolution with 3360 by 1890 at the top end. There is a big drop in image quality quality as a result, even without factoring in Stadia's inherent compression. Fundamentally, the image streamed across simply isn't a 4K picture or anything close to it, despite it saying so. And then right down here, there's actually a side-by-side comparison tool that shows the significant difference in graphical fidelity. I don't know if this is going to show up on YouTube because YouTube compresses videos, but from where I'm sitting right now looking at my monitor, it is very apparent that the image on the left is much blurrier than the image on the right. So details on the road, detail on the hair here, everything is just kind of hazy. Whereas on the right here on Xbox One X, details come across much more sharply with bumps on the road, with the dust and the sand here that's plastered on the car itself. The hair and the distant objects here are just crisp and sharp. And the same can be seen in this screenshot right here. You can see the wrinkles on the skin on Noctis's face and on his lips, and the detail on the hair. All of that is kind of washed away with the blurry nature of Stadia's image quality due to low resolution and compression. And it isn't just about resolution and compression. Turns out this version of Final Fantasy 15, despite running on Google's powerful servers, is just running at lower graphical settings than what you'd find on Xbox One X or, of course, on PC when you max that out. So this right here reads, the big disappointment is that the Stadia hardware server side simply isn't pushing the boat out. There's nothing close to the level of detail seen on the Windows edition. The increased vegetation, improved tessellation, and improved model LODs of that version don't make the grade. The one advantage that's been highlighted is that loading times have been drastically reduced. So this excerpt reads, starting a new game takes 21 seconds to clear the loading screen on Stadia, and that's compared to a 49-second wait on Xbox One X. And then on top of that, there are no downloads involved, so as soon as you purchase the game, you can dive right in, and as far as updates go, that happens behind the scenes. But are these minor conveniences worth the extensive visual and performance compromises that come with getting Final Fantasy 15 on Stadia? Hell no. And keep in mind that when you get Final Fantasy 15 on consoles and whatnot, you have more ownership over the game, and also you don't have to rely on a stable internet connection to access it, play it in a state that is adequate. You know, for all the touting about Google Stadia servers teraflops, seeing games like Final Fantasy 15 run at only 1080 30 FPS is pretty embarrassing, honestly. Next up, we have another game that Eurogamer broke down in terms of its performance and visual fidelity on Stadia. This is Metro Exodus, and according to Eurogamer, it looks as good as Xbox One, but doesn't run as well. On the upside, it would seem as though Metro Exodus does actually deliver on 4K. So this reads, Stadia pushes a native 3840 by 2160 in every shot I've tested. No small feat given the demanding nature of the engine. So when it comes to resolution, it beats out PlayStation 4 Pro's 1440p delivery, and as far as Xbox One X goes, it's on the same level as that console, but the caveat is that we're not getting 60 frames per second like you'd get on a powerful PC. It reads right here, we're stuck at 30 FPS here, and this is once again despite Google's promise that games on Stadia will run at 4K 60 FPS due to how powerful Google Stadia servers are. And what's particularly egregious about this lack of 4K 60 FPS is that people are paying $10 a month for that feature, which is sorely missing across numerous titles. Now, while Metro Exodus for Stadia's resolution matches Xbox One X, the Stadia version does fall short in other factors. So this excerpt reads, one factor that holds Stadia back from matching Xbox One X quality is video encoding quality. And then it talks right here about how Metro Exodus has a lot of darker environments and areas. And so, quote, the blunt truth is that as a result, the darker points of the image show more compression artifacts. This is something that I've seen myself when playing on Stadia. So when I booted up Destiny 2, for example, anytime the screen fades to black, as it's fading to black or fading from black into a cutscene or into the game, you see a lot of artifacting and compression and blotches of squares and stuff. And then there's the fact that Destiny 2 has its own fair share of these darker areas, and I could notice the compression a lot more when I was navigating these darker environments. And with a game like Metro Exodus, which is largely comprised of these darker areas, the compression will be apparent for a lot of the experience. And so that's another drawback to keep in mind. And then Eurogamer concludes with, in comparison with Xbox One X's uncompressed video output, it does start to undo the positives of rendering at 4K on Stadia. And then as far as the settings that Metro Exodus is running in, apparently everything here appears to pair up with PC's high preset with tessellation disabled. Nothing more or less. There's probably like an ultra setting. The Stadia version doesn't quite match up to that, and Eurogamer expresses disappointment at that by stating, quote, in a way that's a shame given the right potential for more. Indeed, given how much of a disparity there is between Stadia's 10.7 teraflops GPU versus Xbox One X's 6.0 teraflops GPU, one would expect a much greater visual disparity. One would expect the Stadia version to have significantly higher settings, but as things currently stand, they look about the same, except that the Stadia version has those compression elements that mark down the visual fidelity. So ultimately, you're still better off playing the game on Xbox One X. Eurogamer added, it's great to see 4K, certainly, but PC features like tessellation would have been the next step. And Metro Exodus, despite the larger teraflops on Stadia, just doesn't push that far, which is unfortunate. Another area where Metro Exodus's Stadia port disappoints is loading times. It takes about a minute to load each area from the main hub, which is more than anticipated when you consider the, quote, server-grade storage. Last but not least, one key area where the Stadia version of Metro Exodus disappoints is in its performance. It reads right here, with Stadia apparently offering more power on tap and operating with equivalent settings to what we understand to be a less powerful machine, performance should be on par or better on Stadia, and yet that's somehow not translated across. The bulk of play is at the same 30 FPS as the Xbox One X, but taxing effects like transparencies cause more of a hit to performance than they do on the Microsoft machine. Shootouts situated in areas lavish in lighting and fog effects run worse on Stadia, and for a console way ahead in its reported GPU power, it's not quite there. In some scenarios, frame rate can even drop down to 20 FPS territory. Add in some stuttering and frame pacing troubles, and it doesn't feel as well optimized as it should be. In similar scenarios on Xbox One X, we're looking at a straight 30 frames per second. I can only imagine how these hardware stutters combined with streaming stutters could pave the road to a frustrating experience, one that doesn't play nearly as consistently and reliably as it should. As a matter of fact, Eurogamer highlights right here that there's also a higher input lag when it comes to playing Metro Exodus on Stadia, which is an additional layer of drawback. It reads, anecdotally speaking, adding around 44 to 55 milliseconds of latency to a game which already had a bit of input lag does it no favors, and it makes precise shooting and action scenes very challenging. So, with Stadia, we're looking at a version of Metro Exodus that looks slightly worse than on Xbox One X despite having the same resolution due to compression. We are looking at worse hardware performance somehow despite Google's hardware being more powerful than Xbox One X, and we are looking at potential internet issues like streaming stutters or input lag. And yet, despite all of these caveats and drawbacks, Google expects us to shell out full price for this inferior version of Metro Exodus. I'd like to remind you once again that during Google's Stadia press conference, they touted how Stadia servers have 10.7 teraflops versus PS4 Pro's 4.2 and Xbox One X's 6.0. Stadia shouldn't just be matching Xbox One X when it comes to visual fidelity, it should be surpassing the console that has about half of what Stadia can achieve in terms of GPU horsepower, and yet Stadia is failing to keep up with Xbox One X. And I'll also remind you again that Phil Harrison promised he stated as fact that games on Stadia would run at 4K 60 frames per second. This is a tweet that he posted back in October 8th, 2019, which reads, "Yes, all games at launch support 4K. We designed Stadia to enable 4K 60 with appropriate TV and bandwidth. We want all games to play 4K 60, but sometimes for artistic reasons, a game is 4K 30, so Stadia always streams at 4K 60 via 2x encode." I can tell you for a fact that Metro Exodus isn't running at 4K 30 because of artistic reasons. It's due to hardware limitations and lack of optimization. There's just something going on behind the scenes that isn't enabling games to run at the highest resolution and the highest frame rate possible. And beyond Final Fantasy 15 and Metro Exodus, we have talked about how Destiny 2 only renders at native 1080p rather than at 4K. And then with Red Dead Redemption 2, there is 1080p or 1440p, but the frame rate at high resolution is at 30 frames per second rather than 60. Now, Google's Phil Harrison did provide a meager response to all this. He said, "We give developers the freedom of how to achieve the best image quality and frame rate on Stadia, and we are impressed with what they have been able to achieve for day one." Really impressed. "We expect that many developers can and in most cases will continue to improve their games on Stadia, and because Stadia lives in our data centers, developers are able to innovate quickly while delivering even better experiences directly to you without the need for game patches or downloads." Okay, well, if that's the case, then you shouldn't be charging money for 4K 60 FPS, given it's a feature that will not be universally implemented, and it certainly shouldn't be a major marketing element for Stadia, because not all games run at 4K 60 FPS, especially the demanding AAA games. And if it's a matter of optimization or developers needing more time to ensure that their games run at 4K 60 FPS on Stadia, well, then Stadia should have been delayed, should have given developers more time to be able to optimize these games, and they should have released a service that lives up to its promise of 4K 60 FPS, especially if they're going to charge money for it. But instead, Google mismarketed, falsely marketed Stadia and its features, and now we're in a situation where things just get more and more embarrassing as more games release and show the flaws of Stadia and its inability to play games with the best visual fidelity and performance despite its more powerful hardware. The visual fidelity isn't there, the performance isn't there, the reliability isn't there, and the value isn't there. What's the point of Stadia, Google? You have to change your business model ASAP to compensate for the drawbacks of Stadia. If you just offer all of Stadia's library at a monthly subscription, then maybe people will be like, okay, there are drawbacks to Stadia, but the fact that I'm getting a whole library of games makes up for the drawbacks, so there's value there. But without that, Stadia is fighting a losing battle, especially as Project xCloud looms on the horizon. So that's my take on this whole situation. The more I see of Stadia, the more incomprehensible this product and this service becomes. But let me know what your thoughts and opinions are on all of this. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.